my name's Kara Felt, and I'm delighted to be here today in conversation with Sunil Gupta as part of the Arnold Newman Lecture Series on photography.
I just want to thank you, Kara, and Diane, and everybody at the gallery for inviting me to speak today. It's, of course, an amazing honor for me to address folks here at the National Gallery of Art. And I'm very glad we're having a fireside chat instead of a lecture from a podium, which is what I thought it's going to look like.
So you were born in New Delhi and you largely grew up there before moving to Canada in 1969. Why don't you get started by just telling us a little bit about the political context in which you began making photographs and how that helped shape your early practice as an artist?
Well, I arrived incredibly straight after Stonewall in September 1969, just up the road in Montreal, knowing very little about where I was landing, with a lot of, obviously, baggage from India. Did a year in high school, which the Indian background didn't do me any good at all. And I've come to think then in later years that the next step, going to college and then discovering gay liberation, was a kind of savior for me. It presented me with an identity that was new and in name and in theory, but not new in terms of practice. So suddenly the thing that I was interested in doing had not only a name identity, but also had this burgeoning politics of marching on the streets. And I was interested, I picked up a camera. I was interested in just hobby photography, and I just accidentally got involved in documenting what was happening around me, which were these demonstrations. And so in a sense, I got my start in this representation of politics. And that image is, of course, says workers' gay solidarity, because the earliest gay rights demonstrators didn't have their own marches. They appeared within other workers' rights marches during May Days and stuff like that. So very much it was tied up with labor relations and the larger body politic. And so this used to get reproduced in our university gay newsletter. We had a kind of magazine that we produced, and I became the de facto photographer. So I photographed all kinds of local gay news and goings on and social stuff. And it was actually a really incredible experience for me. Looking back on it, it was quite unique, and it stopped me from closing off from the host society and entering into some kind of overblown nostalgia for the motherland, the place I'd left, which seemed really far away. Like nobody in my class had heard of India or knew where it was on the map virtually. So this kind of gave me a way into Canada, into the West, into a kind of meaningful life, and also a particular kind of identity and lifestyle that, had I not left India, you see, would not have been possible. So I kind of got lucky in both ways, if you see what I mean. It was, if I stayed in India, none of this would have happened, I don't think.
Yeah. And when you got to New York, the scene appeared quite different, right?
Yeah. So really, I was in business school, and there I met somebody in the university, and I was following him. He moved to New York. He finished before me. He got a job at JP Morgan. They trained him in New York, and I followed Ostensibly, I enrolled in an MBA program, but it's in New York that I encountered the photography world in a way I hadn't really experienced. I never lived anywhere where there was this level of serious interest in photography, meaning putting it in a frame and on the wall. It certainly wasn't happening in India, and it definitely wasn't happening very much in Montreal. Art galleries still only showed painting and sculpture. And although we'd come down frequently to visit New York, I hadn't really appreciated the level of the photography scene. And I slowly got drawn into it and dropped out of my MBA and enrolled at the New School and did some classes with various people.
And you studied with Lisette Model, right? And Lisette Model, for those of you who don't know, she's an Austrian-born American photographer, best known for her very direct portrayals of these idiosyncrasies and sort of larger-than-life personalities of everyday people.
So yeah, I had these. I had a whole semester with her, and she kind of almost single-handedly persuaded me to drop out of doing business school and to do photography. Although I did say to her that I didn't think it was going to make me any money, which was true in the long run. But she was very passionate about it, and she was. So this photograph came out of that experience. You know, one had to make obviously work for the classes, and I was very interested in the street, and especially, and I was suddenly in this city, New York, where the streets were the subject matter of art photography. So not only could you shoot there, but you could show there, and the people appreciated it. And then very quickly, I found my street, so to speak, the gay street, Christopher Street, and was there every weekend just shooting and not really printing a lot because I was still a young, somewhat broke student. So I might have made a couple of prints at the time. And I just collected a lot of contact sheets from that time. And this picture really didn't surface till about 2018, when a book was published of this title and this picture was on the cover.
Yeah, I think you so beautifully capture this very liberated, proud moment of people just strutting through the streets, and this moment after Stonewall, before the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, it was quite extraordinary. I never encountered anything like it, a kind of public space. It's hard to imagine, life before this, that if you're a gay person, you only kind of came out at night and went to nightclubs with even less light in them. So it was quite something to see people in broad daylight in this way. And yeah, people were out promenading in, I guess, a very European way. They were there to be seen and to look. So the looking was very much part of it. And it was also the time of too many men and not enough time. So the camera made a good substitute to collect pictures of people I would have liked to have met, but there wasn't enough time, as they say. So shall I move on to the?
Yeah, because when your next project in India, was this the first time you had returned to India since you left for Canada in the 60s?
Yes, I began to return in 1980, actually, when I was a graduate student in London. And I really went to do some documentary work. My goal was to be a humanist documentary photography guy, so I was interested in those 1950s people, and they were my kind of heroes. So I used to pass through Delhi. It was my hometown. And then I thought, oh, well, I'm going to see what's happening to gay men here. And what I found was that very little was happening. You could barely mention the word, and nobody wanted to speak about it. And nobody wanted to be in a picture, that was for sure. So as a
Yeah, and you
photography
capture that
project,
so beautifully here. These cut-off figures and very anonymous people that you're portraying in this project is such a stark contrast to the Christopher Street.
yeah. So here it's a public space. Of course, there were no private spaces. So this is the opposite reason why we're in the public here. But that is the only place to meet. But then you can't shoot anyone. So this project seemed to be heading nowhere at the time. So I had to drop it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so then I was kind of pretty much based in London, although my relationship came to an end. And like many other things in my life, it generated yet another project. I lived with somebody between the age of 20 and 30. I didn't think it was going to end. So when it ended, I was very surprised. I don't know why, but I was. So I decided to use the camera. The camera is a fantastic way to meet people. I invited myself over to all kinds of gay couples and made a project involving going to their homes, having conversations, and then making a portrait of them. That's the picture on the right here. And on the left is a self-portrait I made with the person I met next with, and we're outside a film that opened called My Beautiful Laundrette, which was addressing multiracial gay couples in London at the time. That became part of a separate project around the Black experience.
And this is a project you've returned to more recently, right?
Yes, these couples. So I did the couples around 85-ish, and again, they didn't have a lot of exhibition history, and I used to just make work, and that interested me. And now, just recently, I've been approached by one of the couples saying that the partner had changed. There was a new person, and would I come and take a new photo, a new couple picture of the new relationship? And so I did. And then I thought, well, you can't just have one photo in photography. It's got to be a whole other series.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought about it, and then I thought, I'm going to expand this into slightly different, but another series of couples, but maybe a wider variety, different ages. I'm at a different place. I'm not 30 something. I'm 60 something, and the people around me are the same. We're just at the beginning of this, but I'm excited. It's something new to go out and shoot in my own time. Again, it's not a commission. It's not for an exhibition. It's not for anybody. It's just for me to flex my camera skills. So I'm a shooter, I have to confess. I just can't stop taking pictures. My assistant says sometimes you're taking too many pictures. Maybe we should just deal with the ones that are already there. So really the 80s in London became a very charged decade. I came out of with my MFA in 83 into a very post-colonial, postmodern world. It was difficult to be postmodern because I had no references. All my references were gay and Indian and stuff like that, which didn't work really. So I began to go to a lot of groups around race, around culture, around photography. And I think very significantly, upon graduation, I kind of voluntarily somewhat turned my back on the commercial art world, because my art training had been leading me to go find a gallery, set up a studio, and do that, be that kind of artist, and sell the pictures. So I didn't do any of that. Instead, I worked with the town hall around cultural policy, around rights and representation and equalities. And so I'm just showing you some examples. So on the left is what we defined Black to be. It wasn't a skin color, it was a post-colonial position. It was everybody who had been, whose parents came from a former British colony. Similarly, on the right is one of the earliest lesbian and gay photography shows that we produced at Camera Work. This is was our local, one of our several locally funded spaces for photography. Photography became a physical space. These town hall funded spaces offered galleries, dark rooms, publications, a place to have a discourse beyond college, to take the discussion out into the city, to talk about race and representation, to talk about sexuality and representation. And as you can see from the photograph, these are the people in the show. We were already aiming to be quite diverse, gender-wise and racially and so on. So this is way back in '86.
And activism, that's always been a really important part of your identity and your practice. How do you feel that it's affected your subject matter and the sort of style and presentation of your work?
Well, quite a lot actually, because I went into school thinking, photo school, I wanted to be like the next Eugene Smith or something, and find my own Minamata project somewhere in India, which was quite possible. And when I came out of college, I discovered, first of all, there was zero funding for that kind of activity. All that was being done by television now, somebody told me. And secondly, my academic training had brought documentary practice into question. So the big question at the beginning of the '80s became, who's taking the picture and for whom? Where does the power lie? And I began to feel I can't go to India, point a Leica at people who barely survive from day to day, take color photochromes of them and put them up in galleries in London and New York. It just didn't seem ethical somehow. It didn't seem right. And so, and the whole notion of how do you get around the ethics of documentary? And so that really made me pause and stop and try to figure out something. And this is what I figured out was this project here, was a step away from that documentary practice. So I went back to Delhi to rephotograph or to begin photographing the gay situation. And this time, without the burden of this representational idea that it has to be some real cruising situation. And sure, that one could do that. I could be hiding behind a bush, wait for people to really come by and start doing whatever it is they do, and then leap out and take a picture of them. That's very possible, but that seemed very unfair. So instead, for this particular series, I enrolled a group of people who became a cast. They became my informants. We went to the sites like this, where people met to have sex, but we went there to take a picture specifically with the people in the picture, and we'd had a discussion about it beforehand. And I would bring the contact sheets back to them after, and have further discussions about, do you think this works, and so on. And maybe I took it as far as I could, because of course often my subjects had no clue what I'm talking about because they had no experience, you see, of having a photograph in an exhibition. It didn't make any sense. In India at the time, you only saw a photograph in the media. It was in print, not on a gallery wall. So they sort of couldn't quite imagine, like, who would want to see them in a gallery, in London? That didn't make any sense at all. Anyway, they went along with it. So also by constructing the picture, if you like, I used text so to add information. I thought the situation was far too complicated for a photograph that can be interpreted in many different ways. I felt I needed to point people to some specific kinds of information. One reason why we're looking at these pictures particularly is that it talks about Americans, and I thought that would be very apropos. How do you bring that into the story?
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking about AIDS and handing out condoms. This is in 1986, 87. This is a decade when the Indian government refused to believe that AIDS had anything to do with them. They thought, oh, it's an American problem. Indians can't get it. Honestly, that's what they thought. And so it's a reminder now that people were talking about AIDS, just nobody paid any attention to them. So to go back to the stylistic thing, this then kind of became a way for me to keep the documentary style. I quite like I'm very drawn to the style of it.
I'm wondering also, sorry, go ahead.
No, what I mean is I didn't want the pictures to become all fantastical. I quite like the way they're sitting in a documentary looking tradition.
Yeah, these call to mind so much for me, 19th century photographs of India, which were largely made by European photographers and focused a lot on monuments and architecture and tended to evacuate Indian people from the frame. And so I'm wondering whether any of that historical imagery was on your mind with this project.
Oh, yeah, very much so, because that's the only history of photography in relation to India that I could get as a student or discover. Was this architectural one, and which had no Indian people in it. And so part of my project here was to bring the focus back to the people who actually utilize the spaces. And so in a way, I could do that. It was a way to bring people, my audience, if you like, into the story with me. It was a hook for them. In fact, it's very funny because coincidentally, I ran into John Falconer last night at the National Gallery here. John, you might know, is a librarian who used to the British Library, looked after the collection of Indian photographs, and I'm very much interested in architecture and archaeology, particularly. He was telling me he's still making exhibitions in India itself around archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
So, let me move on. So by 86, we were having black photography shows funded by the town hall. This led to a group called Autographs. It brought the photographers together. Photographers, as we know, are very isolated, singular, independent people, often don't get together, find it hard to get together. Anyway, we got together, had 2 years of a lot of discussion. At first, we advertised anybody black with a camera could come. And then it turned out that half the people who came who were black with a camera just wanted a job shooting a car. And we thought those are not that's not what we wanted to do with the group, was just find commercial work. So it took a lot of thrashing out what we wanted to do. And finally, this project called Autograph was born with a core group of remaining people who survived 2 years of bitterness and strife in voluntary meetings every week. So it was tough going, but we launched in 88. At the same time, in 88, by 88, British government under Margaret Thatcher launched an all-out offensive against lesbians and gays in the shape of something called Clause 28. So it was local government bill. It basically was trying to make it illegal for town halls to fund any activity that might promote the idea of homosexual relationships being in any way uh, normal family relationships. In fact, they described it as, quote, pretended family relationships. And so there was a huge public outcry against it. These are the demonstration pictures that I took that appeared like that. And then I was in the midst of doing a portrait project with mixed race couples. And it just extended into this clause 28 idea. And I just picked up on this pretended family relationship idea and then made this my first picture because we're not just family, but as a citizenry, we're a family in the state. And if you like, that's our parental figure, is the Houses of Parliament. It's our government. You know, they're the people who allow us to live the way that we can. And I don't know if you can see that whole frame. Mine's a bit cut off here, but then it had an element that was a poem that was sent to being written for me by my then partner, and who was sending them from New York. He was doing his PhD at Columbia. And then on the side, I cut up strips of the demonstration pictures and made a little panel on the right side of black and white pictures. So this was another way in which I kind of broke with my very 70s New Yorkie modernist photography tradition of that sanctity of the full frame and the like. Can you print the entire frame edge to edge? It was really weird for me to cut the negative up because it was a physical act, you see, because it was analog days. So you made the picture and you took the scissors out and cut right through it. So that was quite interesting for me. It was a real milestone that I could cut the picture.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing into conversation these different types of photography, from these staged portraits or posed portraits, and the photographs on the right at protests, which are more almost photojournalistic in a way too. And I'm wondering about this series, maybe as an example of how your work departed from a photographer like Robert Mapplethorpe, who is the best known photographer of the gay scene in this era, whose most controversial works were, so focused on fetishizing the body, and especially the the black body. Were you thinking about his kind of example or legacy at all?
Well, Mapplethorpe became a kind of very two-headed figure in our lives. First of all, obviously, because he was very larger than life and began to be known everywhere, which was great because it gave, if you like, the idea of gay photography some kind of platform. But it wasn't the kind of gay photography one was interested in from an academic standpoint. My entry into the more kind of professional side of photography after college was my first SBE was in 1988. And it was called Partners in Crime, and there were...
And that's the Society for Photographic Education, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And there were two gay men, me and Doug Isha from Chicago, and two women, Koshila Brook from CalArts and Hinda Schumann from Philadelphia. And it's the first time I'd been in a panel discussion talking about our work, and we discovered each other and our interests were very much to do with all kinds of issues around representation of relationships and family and all of that, and almost, well, really very little to do with representations of, I don't know how to put it, like genitalia, well, body parts, let's say. I used to say to people, the sex part of homosexuality is not the issue for me. That's not, I don't feel troubled by it. It's what's represented in this picture that's more troubling, that the government won't allow us to have a relationship. I'll never forget my parents said, or rather my father did, my mom never talked about sex. He said, all you have to do is get married, have kids, and honestly, you can have whatever sex you want. Nobody really cares. So having the sex was not an issue. It's having the relationship that's the issue. That's what they don't like. That you won't get married and have kids. You're going to go off with somebody of your same sex and have a lifelong relationship and not produce the next generation and not buy into all of that kind of family thing. Although I'm having to eat my words now, aren't I, Kara? Because things have changed completely. But back then, it seemed to make a lot of sense.
Right.
I didn't see this part coming anyway. So basically, we didn't think that LGBT photography needed to be necessarily just about, I mean, sure, it was sexy to have the bodies in it, and but I think Mapplethorpe also, because of the censorship controversy and the funding controversy and the whole thing that happened, that in a way everybody had to rally around wherever you were, because we couldn't have him go under either. And I have to admit, it's not a straightforward world. The black male book is very sexy, and in a way, we're glad that someone did it. It can be very critical, but you also can like it. You know what I mean? It's like one of those things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Seems like a very ambivalent relationship.
Yeah, totally. Oh, so yeah, I should. So the 80s carry on, and then I'm now heading towards more curating and filling in gaps, because we waited in the first half of the 80s for our British curators to come and give us the kind of multicultural, intersectional exhibitions that we wanted, and they weren't doing it. So then we had to step out and start doing it ourselves. And so Fabled Territories was one of my first professional curating jobs. It was a survey of photography work by people of South Asian descent in the UK. And from there it went, then it just grew and grew and became my main occupation suddenly. And I stopped working for Fleet Street for a living. I did curating for a living. This was the flip side, which was to go to India and commission 8 young Indians to make work for this show. That this opened in 1990.
And is this the point at which you feel like you were receiving more kind of large scale recognition, or did that come later or earlier?
I got very involved with curating, so I tried to get recognition for that. This is Autograph's first exhibition, Auto Portraits. I joined Oracle. I went to Oracle meetings, and I just sort of, and met a lot of people like Deborah Willis and so on years ago, like that, and formed quite lifelong relationships. Alison North. So I got a feel for and a discussion going with several people through Oracle, that kind of stuff. And then it was threatening it became complicated because I was still shooting, and I didn't know how to bring my own work into a curatorial discussion I'm having with you. You see what I mean? And at first in England, I did the curating so I could have a show to put my work into. It's a big motivating factor. No curators came to me. I made my own show and put my work in it. Then I got a show, you see. That's how it started. but then it became kind of more professionalized and more legitimized, and by then you can't be in your own curatorial project. That was silly. And I tried my hand at teaching a bit, and then this extraordinary thing happened. I got an offer from the Arts Council to start a curating company in the name of multiculturalism, in the name of something called Innova, in the early 90s. And so I did that. I started a company, and I produced 3 curatorial projects a year that toured the UK around post-colonial and postmodern stuff, basically bringing work from England's former colonies back into this country for it to be viewed by as wide an audience as possible. You know, that Africans and Asians make work. I remember telling Oracle that was fun. Can I tell my Oracle story? So I hosted it once here, and in England, I mean. And when you host it, you get to choose. And so who's coming? So I decided only half the people can come from the States, and the other half came from unlikely other parts of the world, you know, from Africa and from India and places they weren't sure about. And when they came, and I said to some people, look, there's a much bigger photography world. You've got to look beyond. And I shouldn't name people, but somebody with quite a key figure in Oracle said to me, you know what, modern photography is an American idea, and we're the keepers. You know, we preserve it in Chicago and New York, and that's how it's going to be. So I said, you know, okay, you know, that's how it is. So, you know, it was interesting to be in there and to be able to have these discussions, because I couldn't have done that from the outside. So you're right, I got known, but not for my work per se. I got known for being a kind of irritating person who would come and jab you in your side about things.
That's hard to believe. Beyond, you know, making connections and networking, how do you feel like your growing curatorial practice affected your own photographic work? And also, besides distracting you from your photographic work?
Well, it kind of broadened my outlook, because I was traveling from a very purist modernist photography aesthetic into a much more, by the time we were making ecstatic antibodies here, for example, much more conceptual, fine art kind of framework. So it had this impact on me. I made this slightly unusual journey from photography into art, if that makes sense. I was curating people who painted, basically, who made conceptual art, who didn't make photography. And then, so it made me feel a bit looser, if you like, about the kind of photography and how to treat photography. So one of the last shows in which I had my own work was this one, the ecstatic antibodies, about AIDS, which I made with a young woman I met at one of the many meetings I used to go to, Tessa Boffin. And we decided to make a very British cultural response to HIV, because of course the US and the Americans were dominating us totally in HIV, and we thought we had a slightly different problem here, because we have the NHS and all that to think about. But I realized we'd run out of time virtually, so
yeah. We've covered a lot, though.
Yeah, we did.
And I'll ask a few questions that have come from our audience. So one comes.
I'll just go through the slides while we're talking, okay?
Okay, great. That sounds wonderful. So one question is about your work with the gay Black group, and specifically your focus on activism and local policy. How did you feel that was received by the wider art community at the time? The question continues, because it feels in many ways that you and your artistic cohort were prefiguring our contemporary era in so many ways, in being intensely project and community and collective based. So how did you feel? Sorry, go ahead.
So I think we were at the cusp of another kind of change. I feel like the generation before us tried to do something similar, but they got rejected. I think it's community-driven Black, ethnic minority, whatever, women's exhibitions, but they were very local and in the town hall or the library, and they weren't seen as like real art, right? The art gallery was not going to show it. So I think the difference with my generation is that we came out of very fancy, I came out of the Royal College of Art with an MA. I could speak the art lingo. I could talk the talk. And so we were taken much more seriously. That's what happened. So that's why it kind of worked with us and hadn't worked beforehand, because we came with the credentials, and we came kind of from, as I was saying, you know, I had access to Oracle. I could raise this in Oracle. Why is it only me and Deborah all the time? And Deborah likes to say, it's just us, like, where are the others? So, are there any others, kind of thing? But I think a few years prior to that, we wouldn't have had access to that kind of meeting and to raise those issues there. Raising those issues in a community center is fine, but it tends to stay there. So we were kind of bridging into the mainstream. My goal was to change. It was to change the discourse around art history, you know, itself in a way.
Absolutely. And can you talk about who your influences were and which artists you follow now?
I have many, and they change over time.
Mm-hmm.
So I say a lot of my big influences are outside of photography. I was really raised on cinema in India. That's all you could see. And in my early years in Montreal, again, there was no photography. It was cinema. So I was really influenced by that whole independent cinema from India, from Japan, from France, from Germany, and Italy, and all that. And just, I think this is why my kind of shift into a constructed documentary narrative instead of the leaping out of the bush kind. It gave me a kind of cinematic control over everything, over the picture. And I think it kind of came from there. And it also made me shift away from trying to find decisive moments, you know, into a much quieter way, and sometimes just stretch a moment out, you know. So I think someone like Antonioni was a big influence, just visually. The scenes from L'Avventura, you know, when the camera just glides out of windows and looks at squares and all of that. That's what used to excite me. It still does. And then it was literature. So when I have time, I try and read fiction. So, you know, Canadians like Alice Munro, you know, that kind of thing. I find her stories really fun to read, and so visual and so quirky. And stuff like, and there's just a lot.
I just love your description of photography as the leaping out of the bush style of photography. I think that's great. I'm going to hold on to that one. Have you ever experimented with making film yourself?
Yes, I did. I was in the late 80s. I made 2 shorts for television here, gay related. There was a gay series, so everything was right about it. Uh, and then I had an awful experience actually doing it because I've been thoroughly spoiled, went to art school and everything. I wasn't used to the idea that in television, production companies own everything and they own you. And first of all, everybody thinks they're really important and everybody's shouting about everything all the time. I couldn't believe the decibel level. Everyone was yelling and everyone, and creating crises where there wasn't any. And then if there was any disagreement between you and them about aesthetics, about where a cut should be, you always lost because they owned everything. The producer would say to me, you know what, if you don't like it, I just want to fire you and I'll get someone else to finish directing it. so, so after two of these, I thought, no way, I'm not going into this world. This isn't for me. I'm much happier like quietly in my dark room or the equivalent, the digital equivalent of it. I can't deal with having people yelling at me and thinking they're super important all the time.
Makes a lot of sense. Another question here is about the legacy of Section 28. And the question is about how Section 28 still haunts today's LGBTQ plus communities and the larger UK culture in general.
Well, yes, I think it's, I'll never forget how homophobic London felt after New York. And I've come to appreciate that there's something here that's there's an underlying antipathy towards non-normative behaviors. We're all supposed to quietly toe the line in many ways. So this walking around the streets, being out and proud is all very well for America, but I think the Brits are a little bit suspicious about it. I think one of the things that the Clause 28 made clear is that we only live with the freedoms that our legal system allows us, and they're constantly under threat. So some years ago, I used to talk to young people who used to tell me that, well, everything is cool now. And I want to say to them, everything is never cool because everything can change overnight. Another Thatcher, another Reagan can get appointed and everything will change, like you had with Wade versus Roe. Everything, it's just a law. Somebody can change it. And I think that the right wing in your country and this one are quite aware of that. And they're always prodding to see if it's possible. And something will start somewhere and then they'll pick it up and then try it out here, We had this ridiculous action the other day outside the Tate, Britain, with suddenly this concerned people arrived saying they object to drag queens. It was so silly. How can you object to drag queens? And this country was completely entertained and lives on pantomime and drag queens. I mean, but it's something they heard coming out of the US again, something like that. And they just want to try it out here. It's really, so I think you just have to, the Clause 28 saga, I think is sort of, one has to remember that also it didn't get reversed till quite recently, so our lovely Labour Party didn't reverse it during its tenure. So, they're not that marvelous. So politics are complicated and it's wise not to turn your back on it because it come and bite you when you're not looking,
Totally. It is foolish to take any right or freedom for granted.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another question is about today's gay scene in India. The question is, so last year, hundreds of same-sex couples staged a kiss-a-thon in a park in Bogota, Colombia, after a gay couple was attacked there for kissing each other. And the question is, could you imagine something like that happening in today's India?
Not really, no. I think because Indians are very physical, they talk with their hands and everything, but they don't demonstrate that kind of kissing level of physical intimacy in public. So it wouldn't. I just can't see it happening. It's in fact walking around hand in hand is more acceptable if you're same sex than if you're opposite sex. So I think a
interesting.
different. Yeah, people have been arrested and harassed for being a boy and a girl out for a stroll together in the park. So yeah, it's. No, I really can't see it happening in India or it having much impact. Because strangely, India's legalized gay sex, but I don't know what happens next there. But I wasn't expecting that. None of my generation thought we'd ever see it legalized uh, in a country that likes to think it goes back 5,000 years and has never changed. So
Right.
why change now? So, but it has. Something's made it change.
And another question here is about what you were saying about the idea of the cut in the pretended family relationship photographs that are on view in the exhibition at National Gallery right now. And the question is about sort of what the genesis of that cut technique is, because it seems to really echo through artists like Catherine Opie and others. And from what I understand, when you originally made pretended family relationships, the presentation appeared much more activist because it was sort of cut and paste techniques. So you were literally physically cutting.
Yeah. It was collage, yeah. It was handmade collages. And it was low budget, so it was all pasted up together. And it was first exhibited in Randolph Street in Chicago, and which we had no budget. We just sort of pinned them up. And so, yeah, the whole thing was very radical politics in action. But yeah, for me, the cut was because also demonstration pictures, I started there thinking that was the perfectly right way to go. And then 10 years later, there's all this doubt has been sown in my mind about what is a demonstration picture, who's taking them and for whom, and whose point of view is it? And if you take a picture of the crowd, then are you acting for Rupert Murdoch and the media? Are you just looking at this crowd of people as some kind of, and then you could call them anything? Or do you want to take them from the inside, looking out? Does that work? And so all this is going through my mind, and I just was generally feeling very much like that they weren't working for me anymore. It wasn't satisfactory to just have the single frame of the demonstration. It really needed to be tagged on to something and not be given that single frame significant, on its own presentation.
Well, I'm just curious, what was the reception like of that project in Chicago? Was that the late 80s you exhibited?
Yeah, late 80s, yeah. Oh, it was quite positive. I had a very nice, welcoming experience from the gallery. Was great, and the people were lovely, and the audience seemed really nice, and people I could very much relate to from my London experience of, college educated, trying to live in a big city on part-time jobs and trying to make some bits of work on the side. So I think we could all relate to each other quite well, and we all thought the world was going to get better. So we had a kind of what's the word, optimistic, despite Thatcher and Reagan being in power, but we were going to overcome them somehow. So Yeah.
Yeah, and the success of that in Chicago seems to me such a powerful statement about how your work can be both culturally, culturally specific and yet really transcend these geographic boundaries and speak to a more universal experience at the same time.
Yeah, I think being lesbian and gay has had its advantages like that. I find I can get off a plane anywhere, whether it's Bogota or Delhi or Tokyo or Chicago, and I find like-minded people who might never have left their cities, but there are distinct commonalities. You know, the coming out, everybody goes through, doesn't matter where you are. There might be cultural differences in how you do it, but you have to go through it. The finding of your fellow other queers, you know, and the relief of finding them, and all of that. It's a fantastically bonding experience. I mean, Hinda and Susan. I mean, Hinda came from Philadelphia. We kind of see each other. I feel I need to see them at least once a year. Every year we meet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
We try. So we just met in Paris. They'd come for a month, so we went over. So it was very nice to just to hang out and feel like, yes, we've had a lifetime apart, but together.
That's really lovely. Well, I'm very sad that we've run out of time. Sunil, I want to thank you again. It's been such a huge pleasure hearing more about your work and your relationship to portraiture as it's evolved over the decades. This is a great place to end with your slide there on the National Gallery in London, right?
Yeah. The gay protest marching by. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Sunil. Thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you so much for inviting me once again. Yeah.